everyone. Welcome to the August 4th edition of the TimeformUS forecast. I'm David Aragona. My usual co-host Craig Milkowski, he's away the second half of this week, so I'm happy to have a guest join me on the podcast this week, one of my favorite guests to have on, Emily Gullikson. Emily, it's a busy summer season for everybody who does handicapping in the races, really anybody who works in horse racing. It's an exciting time, though, because there's so much top-level racing from coast to coast, Saratoga and Del Mar. The Saratoga season, always has a lot of star power, but I know Del Mar has been generating a lot of positive buzz recently with how strong the cards have been there. So I thought it might be a good opportunity on this podcast to do a little handicapping of both. Emily, welcome back to the podcast, and I'm excited to go through these races with you.
Yeah, and you're one of my favorites that invites me on. I always appreciate talking race with you. You challenge me and push me to be better each and every day, and I love going through these type of races. And as far as Del Mar, I agree. It's been a good meet to start out, really competitive races to start the meet, good in terms of for the players as well, positive in terms of the payouts for a lot of the pick fives. That's a popular bet out in California, and just good races all around. And I feel like we're just getting started, but also the weather starts to turn and summer comes in, but it's a busy season. And this is my first summer, which is generally busy for me as it is working live racing out at Hawthorne. And our meet closes around the same time as Saratoga and Del Mar. So it's busy, but I wouldn't trade places with anybody.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. How is that all going for you? Because I know that you always have a lot of focus on multiple tracks, and especially Del Mar during the summer, and now with Hawthorne thrown in the mix. Just tell us a little bit about what you've got going on with Hawthorne and how you juggle all of those responsibilities.
To answer how I juggle all of them, I really don't have an answer. I pretty much keep myself to a schedule, and everything is really busy. I'm doing notes for Woodbine, Horseshoe Indianapolis, Hawthorne, Del Mar this time of year, and that's just a lot of racing, especially with the big full fields with a lot of those circuits. And at Hawthorne, it's just been such a great opportunity for me. They've given me a lot of creative control, trying to do something different, which is always a challenge, right? Because when you're doing something different, it's like, is it going to work? Is it going to fail? Trying to get some feedback, trying to create a lot of events for the local community, because our community here is so strong, and we have a lot of off-site OTPs that are just great, and to get out and meet people and do some pool parties. We did an autograph signing with Jared Loveberry and Larry Ravelli, which was awesome. Had the two Phil's owners come out. It was just a lot of fun. And then being an on-air analyst, which is always something that I've wanted to do and now have the challenge of doing. And it's not easy, and it's very tiring doing that. So I've been just kind of adjusting to that. But again, I love it and really thankful for the opportunities.
No, it's great to see you in that role, and I really appreciate the way that you've gone about it. I know you're somebody that is always championing getting away from doing picks or just giving out 1, 2, 3, 4 selections and having these open-ended conversations about the races and maybe landing on some ideas or, giving out some, angles with which to approach these races that aren't so grounded in just, I like this horse or I'm going to bet this horse and trying to get those opinions out 6 hours before the race happens. I feel like that's a lot more worthwhile for the bettors and the handicappers to listen to. So I really appreciate you, pushing that route and, being able to deliver that to the race goers at Hawthorne. And that's a good segue into what we're going to do on this podcast, because, in talking to you and bringing you on the podcast this week, I was kind of, looking at the Saratoga and Del Mar cards, and typically Craig and I go through a pick 5 sequence and try to, give out a ticket structure, how we're going to play the races. Difficult to do when you're handicapping, 24, 48 hours ahead of time. But I thought for this podcast, we would go away from just thinking about a specific pick 4, pick 5 sequence, because there's so much interesting racing happening on both coasts this weekend. And since you're so focused on Del Mar and I'm, of course, focused on Saratoga, thought we'd mix it up and do 3 races from both venues. I asked Emily to choose her 3 most interesting races that she saw on the Del Mar card. I've chosen 3 races from Saratoga, so we shared them, and we're going to have a discussion about both, and looking forward to going through these races, Emily, because they're not easy.
No, they're not. And I'm glad you chose those. And I think one of the things that I appreciate you as a public handicapper is taking those races that are more complicated and trying to dissect them and provide analysis that's outside of what people see in the standard past performances. I think that's somebody that's in our role as analysts and as public handicappers, is to try to bring some information that people can't see on paper. And picking these races, I think they're gonna help because they're so competitive. There's a lot of ways to go. It gets into the player side because there's horses in these races that could certainly win, but are they the horse that you want to play as they're going to be favored or as the public's going to gravitate in that direction? So I'm excited to talk about these races.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Saratoga card on Saturday. I mean, it's it's probably the best card of the season that they've put out so far. Just interesting races throughout the day, and it's one of those sequences, especially towards the second half of the card, the pick 6 and the pick 5. While we're not going to go through every race in the sequence, there are some heavy favorites in there. I mean, you've got Caravel in race 6, of course, Cody's Wish running in the Whitney, which is part of both the late pick 4 and pick 5, and some of the races that we're going to talk about are in those sequences, and a lot of people will approach these wagers by just saying, okay, Cody's Wish is a single and let me spread in these other races. But you have to narrow it down a little bit because it's easier said than done to just spread in a race like some of the ones that we're going to talk about, because there are a lot of horses that can win and cases to be made for some bigger prices. So with that, let's lay out the plan for this podcast. The races we're going to talk about at Saratoga are races 7, 8, and 11. Those are the Lure, race 7, the Test, the grade 1 that is going as race 8, and also the 11th race, which is a non-stakes event. It's an allowance race, but I think a pretty interesting one with a lot going on. And then as we transition over to Del Mar in the second half of this podcast, we'll be going for races 4, 9, and 11. I believe just one of those is a stakes race. The California Dreaming is race 9, but the other two are interesting allowance races. So Emily, let's kick it off with Saratoga, and we're going to dive into race 7. This is the Lure Stakes, carded on the turf. I would imagine these races are all going to stay on the turf. There has been rain in the Saratoga area on Friday. We're recording this on Friday morning, and I did just see they're taking, I think, 4 races off the turf on this Friday card. I would imagine they're going to try to leave everything on Saturday. We'll see how that works out, especially the stakes races. They'll certainly make an effort to leave on the turf, but it will be a situation where we could have some give in the ground, so I think that is something to note. And this is just a race that I chose, Emily, because I don't really know who the horse to beat is. I mean, there are so many ways to go. I think there are 3 or 4 horses that are going to take quite a bit of money, especially some of those drawn down towards the inside. But based on speed figures and form lines, it's not like they have a huge advantage over their rivals. And it's one of those races where I could make a case for just about every horse in the field. So how are you viewing this one?
I saw it similar, and I think it is going to come down to how they are going to bet the race. In terms of the morning line favorite, Dakota Gold, I feel a horse that maybe is a little bit vulnerable in this spot. Some other horses in this field, they've struggled in graded stakes company. I think they were looking to run in a listed stakes, hoping they'd catch a soft field. And this isn't a soft field because you mentioned there's so many in here that are competitive with each other and number wise and class wise. And in terms of pace, it's also one of those races that the pace is going to really come into play. A lot of these horses that want to be on or near the lead, especially a couple horses on the outside, Dr. Davis, Midday Image, horses that are definitely longer shots to win, but have a role in this race because they're likely to be forwardly placed and keep horses honest on the front end. What they end up doing with Portfolio Company, it's like there's so many storylines in how this race can play out that it just is so much more than let me just try to find who's the best horse.
Yeah, let's approach it by price tiers, I suppose, first. I mean, I do want to mention those 3 horses drawn down towards the inside that I think are going to take the most money. I agree with you on Dakota Gold. He's fine. He's obviously really stepped up his form as a 4-year-old. He took so much money last time in that Hudson Valley because he had a bit of a trip at his prior start, the Kingston, where he arguably should have won that race, kind of got held up in traffic at the top of the stretch, made a big late run. But while he did deliver last time as the heavy favorite and looked great doing it, he got a great pace set up and was just beating horses that I think are a cut below what he's facing here. So he can definitely win this race. I don't think he's going to offer value at a very short price, so I wanted to look elsewhere. And as for Portfolio Company and Smoke and Tea, Portfolio Company is a horse that, kind of like Dakota Gold, feels like he stepped forward during his 4-year-old season. He's won 2 in a row, but those have come against weaker in optional claiming races at Belmont. He's a horse that, watching a lot of his races, he's got this tendency to pull really hard on his riders in the early stages, and he was able to get away with that the last couple of times, but now drawing the rail, if he refuses to settle when Joel Rosario tries to tuck him in behind horses, that could be an issue for him. I do think Joel's a good fit for him, and he's ridden this horse well in the past. Other riders have had trouble on him, but there is that concern for a horse that's going to be a relatively short price, and Smoke and Tea, he's fine. I feel like he's gotten some pretty good trips in his recent races. Another one that seems to be in that mix, but I feel like he'd have to take a step forward to really be competitive here, and he's one that's been pretty popular at the windows in recent starts. So when I sort of went through this race, Emily, and was thinking about value, not that I am against any of those horses from a standpoint of their likelihood to win the race, but I just kind of saw all of them as being somewhat negative value, and I wanted to look towards all of the horses drawn towards the outside and decide where I was going among them and which of those I wanted to key on, because I think there are multiple runners drawn towards the outside or in the middle of the field that are going to offer some better value than those that I just discussed.
Yeah, I honestly, I won't bore the audience and repeat what you just said because I really don't have much more to add. I think you hit on all the points. Certainly capable horses. They're going to be short prices, and there's other ways to go.
So who are you looking at that is a bigger price on my morning line or potentially has a better chance to win this race?
There's two horses that are double digits in here, and I'm not really sure where to start. I guess I'll just go in numerical order with Ocean Atlantique and Tiz the Bomb. I actually prefer Tiz the Bomb, but talking about Ocean Atlantique first, he's a horse that just has some buried class that makes him a fit, and also races here at Saratoga and with Saez. Some of those races being some of the stronger speed figures. He's another horse that could be forwardly placed. Doesn't necessarily need the lead either, and I think his most recent running lines, you can make some excuses for them. Just a little bit out of his element in the Grade 1 Manhattan, going 10 furlongs. He had trouble in the Grade 1 Turf Classic, that being a Grade 1 race and still a very competitive race. And those races back at Turfway Park, I know sometimes they're a little bit tough to assess, but those races were both good. And again, has back races and just could be kind of putting it all together. And one I wanted to keep on the radar at a price. And like I said, Tiz the Bomb is one that I'm going to actually key on. I think if he's anywhere near that morning line, he's an absolute play. I don't think they've done this horse any favors by running him longer. I don't think that's his ideal. This distance suits him. He's coming off a trip in the stakes race at Ellis Park back on June 17th, where he was against the flow and had that kind of trouble late. But I think being against the flow was against him more than anything. And again, the longer races, again, did him no favor, so I can just give an excuse for all those races. Getting back to his top form at this type of distance in graded stakes races, even his Hall of Fame race here last season, 93 optics figure, a B minus, that stacks up with this level in terms of class, in terms of race par. He's coming into this race with form. Just another one that's probably going to get overlooked and fits this field.
Yeah, I think those are both interesting horses. I was probably a little more interested in Ocean Atlantique of the two. Not that I completely trust this horse for all the reasons that you laid out. He does have some of those bigger figures on synthetic, though it seems like he handles the turf just fine. If I was confident he could run back to that Turf Classic performance at Churchill 2 back, I think he'd be a major contender to win this race. He is one of those horses that is a bit up and down, somewhat unreliable. The Manhattan last time, like you said, just the wrong spot. And also, Luis Saez kind of overdid it in the opening quarter mile of that race. This horse broke a step slowly, and he got really aggressive trying to send him up to go for the front end that day, and the horse just ran off with him a little bit, so I'm not going to hold it against him so much that he came up empty in the last half mile of that race. This is a better spot for him, and the pace scenario, I mean, we haven't talked about it too much, but it's a little murky. I mean, there are some horses drawn towards the outside, like Dr. Davis and Midday Image, that probably want to go forward, but it's unclear how fast some of those horses really are, and with Saez aboard, I wouldn't be surprised if Ocean Atlantique has some intentions of going for the front end, because he's definitely been successful using that style in the past. So he's one that I feel like will be a price in this race, and one that I could definitely use. Tiz the Bomb, Emily, is a difficult horse for me because I've kind of never been a fan of his. I've always thought he was overrated when he was considered one of the better 3-year-olds out there, and maybe I should reassess, because it feels like a lot of people have just jumped jumped ship from the bandwagon, and he's a horse that's now going off at better prices in some races. I agree that a mile and a half, those marathon distances, didn't work for him. He actually didn't even run that badly in the Elkhorn 3-back. That was a pace that fell apart, and he actually held on pretty well for fifth that day. And yet last time, he should have won that race at Ellis, just got into some traffic trouble late. I still have trouble pegging his overall quality because from a speed figure standpoint, I mean, especially looking at the buyers and TimeformUS, he's still a cut below some of the best in here, but he has had legitimate excuses. So at the price, I could understand using him. I do want to discuss the two horses that are drawn right in between the pair that we just mentioned. The horse that I'm most interested in this race is Speaking Scout, and he's not as big a price as some of the ones that we just discussed, but I don't think he's supposed to be because he's got rock solid form. He was a Grade 1 winner last year in the Hollywood Derby, albeit not the strongest Grade 1, but ran well to win that race and certainly wasn't disgraced in the Pegasus World Cup turf earlier this year. His last couple of races, I think, are better than they look. I mean, he was trying to close through traffic in that Dinner Party 2-back. It was a blanket finish, but I think that's proven to be a pretty strong race. We've seen some nice runbacks out of there. And then last time in the Monmouth, that was a really weird ride and a weird race. The horse that finished second, Never Explained, got really keen heading onto the backstretch and kind of suckered the rider on Speaking Scout to make this premature move at that point in the race as the horse just kind of got angled off the inside without cover. And once he saw daylight, he too took off down the backstretch. And both of these horses made premature moves. And while Never Explained was able to save some ground after that, Speaking Scout got hung out 3 wide around the far turn and actually was finishing on decently at the end despite never changing leads. So I think he's better than that last performance. We've seen good runbacks out of that race as Catnip and Never Explained both came back to run well despite not winning their next starts. I just think Speaking Scout makes a ton of sense in here and will probably be a slightly better price than some of those that are drawn down towards the inside.
First of all, I mean, I'm never going to talk anybody off the Hawthorne Derby winner, so let's start there. But I agree with you for all those reasons. I think he's super logical. When I kind of started off by talking about making that drop to just kind of find that right stakes company to get a win, I think that's exactly the move for this horse. And Flavian Pratt getting aboard, that can't hurt either, as you mentioned, kind of some of those rides. So I agree. I think he's very logical in here. One I'm definitely going to use.
And before we move away from this race, the real wild card in here is the number 6 Chasamy, who just looking at his foreign running lines, it's a little odd. I mean, he's a horse that has taken a long time to come around. I mean, he looked terrible at the start of his career, just uncompetitive in a series of races. I think his rider even pulled him up one time because he was not traveling well in a race on synthetic, but something has clearly changed in his last 3 starts as he took a lot of money when they dropped him in class. And if you watch those races at Dundalk and Nos 2-back, I mean, he was so much the best there. I mean, obviously the level of competition was much lower, but he just looks like a horse where the light bulb has gone on and he has figured it out. And even his last race, there's an argument that he could have won that spot if he had gotten clear a little bit earlier. And the fact that these connections that don't ship over that much are bringing him over, I think it speaks to the fact that he's well-intentioned here. James Stack, he also has a horse that I believe was the winner of the Belmont Oaks, and I think she's running in the Saratoga Derby on this card. So it's not like this is the only horse that the connections are bringing over, but just feels like one that might be a little sneaky in this spot, because I know just based on the Timeform ratings and stuff like that, he might not look so competitive with this field if you're comparing it to the US-based speed figures. But one thing I love about TimeformUS is for these foreign horses, you get really detailed foreign commentary from the Timeform analysts, and all they're writing about this horse in the last couple races is keeps improving, has another step forward in him. So he's one that I don't want to dismiss, especially if he's a big price in this race.
Yeah, and I wonder just how they're going to bet him, because of a lot of the European horses just automatically get bet. So I had a hard time just kind of understanding like how he was going to get played in this type of race. And I don't disagree that this horse has obviously started to take that step forward and on the improve in those races. And this is probably maybe a step up in class. If anything, is more of a lateral move. So he's going to have to come into this race and run a top effort. It's not like he stands over this field and he can come with kind of a mid-type effort, to win. The other thing that just kind of caught my eye about this horse is the timing of his races. because he has the layoff lines between each and every start. And he's going to come into this race in pretty much the only time in his career that he's second off a layoff, running back in 34 days off that big effort, which is probably maybe his best race, just given the level of competition that he had to run against on July 2nd. So that was just kind of something that kind of stood out to me in terms of the timing and intent for this horse showing up in this spot where, again, I think he's going to have to run his best race in order to win.
Yeah, that's a good point. He's really never handled a normal turnaround before of about a month or less, so it's something new for him. Not going to mind some given the ground, because I think that course he won over 2 back was rated heavy, 7 furlongs in nearly a minute and 40 seconds. So however what the turf course is on Saturday, he's not going to mind it. Let's move on to race 8, the Grade 1 test. And, Emily, the test is always one of the races that I look forward to the most at Saratoga in the summertime, because it's one that typically gets a lot of turnbacks from longer races, some horses stretching out, often runners that might be making their stakes debuts, moving up in class. It just always feels like every year it attracts horses coming from multiple directions, and it makes an interesting race to handicap, and that's certainly the case this year. In addition to all that, I feel like we've got some really talented fillies in the mix.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting race, and almost like the race we were just talking about, where there's not a lot of separation kind of in the main contenders of this race, and many of them coming back from the Acorn, where they faced each other and then finding a distance change in that race that could upgrade, and then Maple Leaf Mel, who's been just ultra consistent and looking to pair up another win. So there's a lot of horses in this race, and what makes it competitive, a lot of horses that know how to win. And you don't kind of see that, you don't see that often, right? And they're tight in terms of numbers. They've run against each other. It's a good race. Another one that probably you want to have a price, because you can make a case for many in here.
You really can. Even some of the horses that are going to be double digits in here are not bad. I mean, they have certainly their own merits. So let's discuss. I think before we get into the Acorn discussion, because there are a few horses coming out of there, as you mentioned, I think this is the kind of race where you do have to develop an opinion about Maple Leaf Mel. I made her the slight second choice in the morning line. I won't be surprised if she goes favorite in here. I mean, she's just one of these horses that is going to attract a lot of support. She's really never been challenged in her career. 5 victories by clear margins, has just never been headed at any point in her races. She always has a clear lead and just dominates on the front end. It's a positive for her that she drew the outside post position, because I think that gives Joel Rosario some options in case somebody else breaks a little sharper. Horses tend to relax a little better when they're on the outside, not having to deal with that kickback. But she's still a horse that's never rated off another in the past, and there are some other fast runners in this field. And she's also been improving with every start, and she runs a new career top every time they step her up in class. Feels like at some point there's got to be a ceiling to that.
Yeah, and she's another one that you can kind of say the same case in terms of a quick turnaround. She's had a lot of time between starts, except for going back to Saratoga last year when she just improved on a quicker turnaround, but is going to come back, face a tougher group today and a tougher pace scenario with the horse, especially with Money's Gold just drawn to her inside. The pace should be contested in here. Both those horses have that early speed, drawn side by side, and I don't think you can let Money's Gold go too far, right? She's got to kind of keep her honest. I mean, Money's Gold, I know we're going to get to the Acorn, but she's probably in this spot, especially with the price discrepancy. If you like her, this would be the time that you want to jump back on board. But yeah, those two look to keep it super honest up front, clearly unhinged, maybe tries to push the pace. I don't know if she's quite quick enough. But yeah, Maple Leaf Mel is gonna get a test today. But off of races, like you said, there's nothing to really knock.
Yeah, post position often dictates the rider tactics in these situations, and I think clearly unhinged. I mean, she kind of has to go as fast as she can from the rail to try to hold that position. Like you said, we'll see if she's fast enough. She does appear to be the third fastest, at least that's the case for looking at the pace projector, but sometimes these riders drawn in the outside post, they get a little bit, cautious. They wait to see what riders to the inside are doing coming out of the starting gate, so we'll see what kind of chess match percolates out of the starting gate. let's talk about Money's Gold, because I'm glad you kind of brought her up with regard to, her early competition with Maple Leaf Mel. I mean, she's a horse that I think the first inclination is to say, all right, she was brilliant sprinting earlier in her career. They experimented in the Acorn. It didn't work. Now she's turning back to the right race. She's just going to go back to being this super horse that earns speed figures that the others in this field find untouchable. I don't know that I quite buy it, Emily. I mean, she is a horse that was, freakishly talented, obviously, when she debuted last summer at Monmouth. And, we saw glimpses of that talent, certainly at Tampa when she broke that track record, going 7 furlongs back in March. I know that she's had excuses for her last couple of races. I still haven't loved either of those efforts. And more than the Acorn, which I get, the distance was wrong, I'm holding the 8 Bells against her because she was supposed to win that race. And looking at the horses that she faced in that 8 Bells, that has been one of the most negative key races that I think I've ever come across. I mean, you look at the runbacks from that 8 Bells and just horse after horse has just completely fallen apart in their next start. I mean, actually, Money's Gold's 4th place finish in the Acorn is one of the best runbacks of anybody out of the 8 Bells. And it just seems like a race that looked strong at the time, and maybe reassessing it in retrospect, it was a worse performance than maybe we even realized. And I just wonder if maybe Money's Gold is not going to be able to get back to that brilliance that we saw earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question, and why maybe there's some of the others in here that will take more money, and people kind of shy away from her because she has burned money at a short price. Now, if you are looking for any type of excuse in the 8 Bells, it could be the fact that she just ran that huge race at Tampa. I mean, that is just such a big effort that you would expect a horse to regress off that type of effort. New top, coming off a 2-month break, second start on the year, came back in 40 days. 40 days is reasonable recovery, but if a horse has just run such a big race, they might need more. It's tough to know. And I mean, she did have to duel, was a pretty taxing effort that day. So again, wasn't crazy about her in the Acorn for a lot of reasons, and likely to see that regression there. Now she's coming back off that 57-day break for this race, but also you can even add in that the Acorn race just in terms of her form cycle, right? If she's not quite at her peak, we weren't going to see a top effort that day. So she's probably had even a little bit more recovery. And this would be the time that she does, if she is going to, this would be the time for her to do it. And especially if some of the others in here aren't quick enough to get the lead or want to try to rate and get first run on her, she could just be tough on the front end. And I agree with you. And I wasn't one that was like quickly to be like, she's the superstar and brilliant. I take more of a cautious approach on that. So I'm not one that's coming from the like, I've always loved her and I'm keeping the faith. It just kind of seems like this would be the time and place for her to get back on track.
No, I mean, I get it. I mean, it sounds like you're more positive on her than I am a little bit. But again, I mean, I think you're saying you'd want to get that 7-2 price. I'm not sure how she's going to get bet in this race. If she's 5-2, a similar price to Pretty Mischievous, she probably becomes a little bit less interesting. But you're kind of assuming people are going to jump off the bandwagon a little bit after those last couple of races. Just one more thing on her. I find it strange that she's been training at Churchill Downs. Not something Todd Pletcher does with his top horses, that kind of all in Saratoga. Just weird that he took her back there after the Acorn. Just something strange that I can't recall really seeing with top horses, especially one that you kind of know is pointing to a race in Saratoga. So I don't know what it means, just something I wanted to point out that caught my eye. Emily, Pretty Mischievous, to me, she's just the horse to beat in this race. I really don't have that many knocks on her. I mean, some people are going to maybe be skeptical of the turn back and distance. I get it. I mean, she's probably not a horse that wants to go 1.25 miles in the Alabama. So, I mean, this is the next best option if you're going to try to point to a grade 1 at Saratoga. And, she's gone shorter earlier in her career, especially with the blinkers on. She's just a really handy traveler. She races in the bridle, and with pace in this race, it just feels like she's supposed to get the right setup. I think she deserves to be the favorite. I don't have a huge knock against her.
Yeah, same. It's just other than the short price, and you kind of mentioned it, that she just might land in the right trip, and that's kind of been the key with her, is she has just kind of found the right trip. And sometimes that's not a knock on horses. Sometimes that's just their class, that they put them in the race. That's something that took me way too long to learn, and I'm kind of starting to figure that out, that good horses can just put themselves in the race, and that's sort of what she's done. she's had some excuses just in terms of the timing and the races that she didn't win. And even when she didn't win, she still ran well, all things considered, and then validated herself in a following start. The distance doesn't bother me at all. Trip from the inside, and again, it's just going to come down to how they push the pace early on, because that she is on the inside. There's the speed's drawn to her outside. I don't know if she's going to be able to kind of get in that 1-2 lengths off the pace setters that she did when she had those inside posts. And her other races where she was kind of stalking from the outside gave her a little bit more flexibility. So maybe trip comes into play a little bit more than it might look on paper. But again, if she's handy enough to kind of work a trip, that was just kind of the maybe 2 knocks on her, if anything, is having to get a trip from the inside as well as being a short price, but otherwise extremely logical.
Yeah, Post definitely not ideal for a turnback like her, but I agree with everything else. And that's kind of the reason why I'm more positive on Darth Vader at the price that she's expected to be in this race, because she's just not a horse that takes nearly as much money as the Pretty Mischievous, and she doesn't have that brilliance of Money's Gold or Maple Leaf Mel, so it feels like she's going to be that solid fourth choice in this race. And I actually like her turning back even more than I do Pretty Mischievous. I mean, she was an effective sprinter earlier in her career, actually ran some of her best speed figure sprinting as a 2-year-old. I thought the Kentucky Oaks was just the wrong race for her, but she actually ran a lot better than I even expected in that spot. And then last time in the Acorn, I appreciate how game she was in the final eighth of a mile of that race, because she got passed by a full length by Money's Gold at the top of the stretch, and she just refused to give up and was coming back on that rival at the finish. I mean, that was her first start for the George Weaver barn. It felt like she took a big step forward. I think she's really interesting in this race, one of the more likely winners, and I think she's going to be a fair price.
Yeah, I feel like she kind of has that wise guy feel to me. That's just sort of when I was assessing her for kind of those reasons, right? You isolate her 1-turn races, they're all extremely good. The Devona Dale, people, she went off at a big price, but there was still a lot of people that gave her a big look that day for the right reasons and have been kind of following her ever since, kind of building a fan club off that. And she's game. She is as good a good racehorse as you like to see, because for those reasons, like she'll look like she's out, she's going to drop back, and then she'll find her way and fight back in. Mentioned the Kentucky Oaks, totally agree. That was just not the right spot. And then again, she just does the same thing. She's like, I'm just going to run my race. Maybe I'm not good enough, but I'm going to show up and I'm going to run it. And so that always makes a horse dangerous. Another one that price wise, I think is probably maybe going to be around the morning line, but I think she does have a fan club built around her that won't let it drift too much from that. And I'm okay with her. She just doesn't get me as excited as she does for you.
Yeah, I guess I'm taking the wise guy angle with her, because she makes just a ton of sense to me in this race. And you mentioned maybe some bigger prices in here. I mean, among those that I've got as double digits on the line, were there anybody else that was jumping out at you?
I mean, Jersey Pearl, I think is worth talking about. It's always tough to dismiss a horse who's just getting faster and faster with every race, not only just like winning, but she's getting faster and faster. She's been able to carry her race and that to each track. The Ellis Park races, it's tough because a lot of the days and a lot of the race days there, having early speed was such an advantage. She broke a little bit slow in that most recent start, moved herself up on the inside, drew off from the field. I don't know how good she is. I respect the connections taking a shot in here and finding out how good she is. And there's nobody, as going through this field, it's like you kind of felt like Interpolate would kind of be that horse, and like going back and watching that race, I was like, I can't quite get there.
Yeah.
In terms of Money's Gold, I think again probably the right spot for her. At least the connections after coming up short at a short price are going to come back on this big stage in a Grade 1. Training over at Churchill, I agree with you, that is weird, but just kind of seems like that. I just can't. There's nobody in this race that I can really feel solid on, and this one is a stab, but at least one I'm gonna kind of keep on the radar, and let's find out how good she is. She's versatile, has some early speed, and we're gonna find out the class on this race day.
Yeah, I don't think that's crazy at all. If there's a horse that's double digits in here in terms of odds that wins, I think it is going to be Jersey Pearl. Not that I love her either, but her last couple races have been good. She beat a really nice horse two back at Churchill, and I looking at the results, I didn't see that day she competed as Ellis as a huge speed bias. I mean, obviously speed is always good at Ellis, but it wasn't one of those days where it just seemed like a conveyor belt on the front end and the rail. So we'll see if she's able to make the step up in class. Let's move on to the last race we're going to discuss from Saratoga. Moving on to race 11. This is after all the stakes races, a really interesting first level allowance race, going the same distance as the test, 7 furlongs. And this is one of those Saratoga allowance races that I think we all look forward to every summer, Emily, because you've got some horses that are coming back off layoffs that looked like they once had promise, some hardened older horses with some really nice speed figures that are going to be facing these up-and-comers. It's just a really nice mix in here and a lot of ways to go.
Yeah, and I love a horse in this race. I love that Ever So Mischievous is the short price on the morning line because I would never want to play this horse, and so I love the fact that he's in this race. I think there's so many other ways to go in here, and horses like you mentioned that are on coming back off layoffs that we probably haven't seen the best of. We could see the best of them today. I'm kind of in that camp. I'm leaning on both shug runners. I can make cases for both. Watching the work between Signator and Capture the Flag could give the slight edge to Signator, just kind of off those visuals, but Capture the Flag also has some ability. I'm leaning that way in this race, but I think there's other ways to go, and it turns into a good betting race if you are like me and wanting to take on Ever So Mischievous.
Yeah, Ever So Mischievous is one of those horses that has a big following. He's been very short prices in all 3 starts, and he's only won one of them. I mean, he's lost twice at odds on, and I think those are horses that you kind of have to start to regard with a little bit of skepticism. And yeah, he was wired last time at Ellis by a horse that probably took advantage of the track profile, but he was also on his wrong lead in the stretch, just didn't look totally focused. Now they're putting the blinkers on, probably in an effort to correct that. And when you start to put some band-aids on these heavy favorites, I think they just become even more vulnerable. So I agree with you. I think he's a horse that definitely is beatable in this race.
I mean, even before we move on, but even if he runs back to those races, are they stronger than anybody else in this field? No. Like
No.
he's not a standout in any way. Again, it's a lot of the hype, the connections. If I'm looking at Optics plot, which has horses in relationship to each other, both in terms of positional speed and finishing ability, he doesn't have an edge over Brew Pub or Caramel Chip, 2 horses that are probably a little bit softer in terms of class. But that just tells me right away, if I'm making that case for those 2, Ever So Mischievous is a little bit behind that pair.
Well, yeah, I do want to sort of talk about that a little bit because in these races, it feels like sometimes the public goes a little overboard on the horses with potential and sort of disregards some of those that have the proven form at this level. And, Caramel Chip, yeah, he's a horse that has run really well in a series of starts. He loves to win races. I think that he's coming out of some weaker spots, some starter allowance races that, like you said, were a little bit softer. And I know his last race, I mean, if you're looking at Buyers or Timeform, got a really nice speed figure. The horse that was second in that race came back the other day, albeit going 1.25 miles, but was really disappointing. And I just have some questions about the quality of the fields he's been facing. Brewpub is a horse that I don't want to just totally write off. I know that he never wins, and he settles for second way too often, but it does feel like he's taken a step forward for the Rudy Rodriguez barn. He actually got him to the winner's circle 3 back, and he's twice in a row run well against decent allowance horses. He's piled up the second place finishes, but he's a horse that I just think makes a lot of sense from many angles in this race. He's going to run well, he's reliable, and he's just going to slip through the cracks because there's not anything sexy about him.
Well, and I mentioned those 3 horses and how they look on the plot, and if just from a pure math standpoint, you just move him to the top because he's going to be the longer of those 3. Not one that I certainly would trust to win, especially the distance change a little bit class wise. He's run well in good company, but even class par, this is a little bit higher optics figure range, and even the purse, just comparing where he's run under similar conditions in the past. He's come up a little bit short, but if the number's right, you're a little bit questionable on some of the others, you can definitely make the case just on value alone.
Yeah, you brought up the two Shug McGahee runners, Signator and Capture the Flag. Both were horses that garnered a lot of buzz last year when they won their maiden races as 2-year-olds. I know Signator was a horse that a lot of people were looking forward to potentially making a splash on the Kentucky Derby trail. Unfortunately, he went to the sidelines, but I mean, he cost $1.7 million as a 2-year-old in training. I mean, there have always been high expectations for him. This feels like it might be a stepping stone for both of these horses. Not saying they don't have the talent to win here, because they're clearly good. Signator in particular seems like one that, is eventually going to pan out, just given the way that he's been trading for the comeback. I just wonder if they're really targeting this 7-furlong race, or if they're using this as a jumping off point. And the same thing for Capture the Flag, who, I mean, he looked great winning that maiden race at Saratoga last year. That is a really bad field that he beat him. If you look up the other horses in there, I mean,
I agree.
Yeah.
I 100% agree. And the figure didn't come back strong either.
No. And also, you can cover your ears if you want, because I know you don't participate in this conversation, but Capture the Flag has a huge turf pedigree on the bottom side, and just looking at the way he moves, I'm not going to be surprised if he lands on turf in his next start. So just something to consider with those horses. Signator, I think, he can win this race just on, that class alone, but I wonder if he's one that might get bet down a little bit off that line that I said. He's a horse that I could kind of go either way on, depending on the price.
I think that's fair. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned like in terms of his ability, I mean, they were going to run in the Nashua before getting sidelined in that race. So obviously graded stakes is where they're pointing, but just might be good enough to win in this race. And even still, having that conversation of a horse using a race as a jumping off point, they could still win, right? If they're good enough, if this horse is good enough, he could run a race much better than what he's run off those 2 prior starts, and then still take a step forward in a second start off the layoff if he's that good. And my concerns were kind of the same, and Capture the Flag kind of just jumped out a little bit and did the same kind of digging. Was like, wow, that was an extremely weak field and a small field. And watching his works, I don't disagree that he could handle the turf either. And maybe that's where I just think he's, of that group coming back, he just might have the most upside. And this would be kind of the time to find out of those two. But I agree. I think there's reasons to have reservations as well. The other horse that was interesting to me is Bourbon Bash on the cutback. It's kind of the same, sort of some of the same angles that you talked about with Darth Vader, maybe not as gritty, but seems like a horse that off the visuals is more of a one-turn type, class-wise, maybe not always in the right spots in terms of those graded stakes races, even some of the stakes races out of Oaklawn Park that are pretty contentious, and also some of the trips and rides. And again, just looks like a one-turn type, getting a little bit of conditioning now that he's coming back off a good allowance race 2 weeks ago where he made a move and he was wide despite being from the rail. And I made a joke about this on Twitter that, if you miss this horse, just wait, because Lucas will bring him back in another week. And I don't know why some people took that like I was being like negative, but it's just kind of this horse comes back.
It's just the facts.
Yeah, it's what he does. And when horses start going well, and this horse has run back on short rest in the past, a little bit longer, 3 weeks, but he's improved number wise when they've done that. So I don't mind this horse at all.
Yeah, I mean, I made this horse my best bet when he ran last time at Saratoga. Just for all the reasons you mentioned, I thought he was super interesting in that spot. And I thought he ran well. I mean, he was 10-1 and he finished second against a really good horse and Accretive. Watching that race at the quarter pole, I was like, oh, this horse is going to win. I mean, he's moving at a different rate than the others. He ranged up like he was just going to go right on past Accretive, and maybe the class kicked in on that favorite, but Bourbon Bash just spit the bit at the end of that race. And he is a horse that just seems like he's a little faint-hearted, but I agree. He's interesting for that reason. In this race, he's going to be probably even a bigger price than last time. So I get it. I kind of got burned a little by him last time, so I'm not going to try him again, but I understand that case. Emily, I think a horse like the number 5 Frat Pack could easily win this race and is not going to be the kind of short price that Ever So Mischievous is, despite having a similar speed figure last time out, at least from DRF and TimeformUS that I'm looking at. It was an uncompetitive spot, but the horse that he beat in that maiden win last time, Magico, is a horse that another Chad Brown runner that I thought was trading exceptionally well for his debut, took a ton of money like he was meant to win that race. And Frat Pack was just better than him off the layoff. I mean, he had faced obviously a really good horse when he debuted last summer at Saratoga. He's got sloppy tracks twice in a row, probably going to get finally on a dry track on Saturday. And it's not like, while there are multiple horses that can be forward in this race, I don't see that many horses that are need the lead types or kind of have to be in front to win. I feel like there's going to be a lot of breaking from the gate and just like looking to the left and right among the jockeys to see who's going. I feel like Flavien Prat's going to go on this horse. And if anybody wires the field, I feel like it's going to be him. And he's probably not going to be that short a price.
Yeah, I kind of thought he would be shorter, handicapping kind of before the morning line, just off the figures for the connections, maybe even with that slight pace advantage. But running back to those races, he fits in here. There are challenges. He's going to take on winners for the first time. There's obviously been some issues with this horse. Making that return as a 4-year-old didn't start until the middle of the 3-year-old season. So there's obviously some of those things. He's going to have to pair up races back to back and show up. But a lightly race type that offers 2 races, you can't knock him as an individual. It's just, is he going to continue to run those races and improve?
I think we've covered that one and those Saratoga races pretty well. So let's move on to the second half of this podcast and over to the West Coast to discuss some Del Mar racing. And you've picked 3 difficult ones, Emily. Beginning with this 4th race, it's a 1 mile on the main track, optional claimer, nominal to 2 other than is the allowance condition here. And some familiar names in here, particularly the number 6, Justique, who feels like a horse that, just given the class relief, is going to take a lot of money. And she's one that is a bit of an enigma because she was so impressive winning her debut last year, generated a ton of buzz off that, but she kind of hasn't panned out the way that I think people wanted her to. And I'm a little confused as to why they're running in another 2-turn race.
I am glad they're running her another 2-turn race. I'm not worried about the distance at all. I think that was part of the concern last year. She's so much better at the 1 turns. Maybe she's just better at Del Mar. We're going to find out. But in terms of the other races around 2 turns, it's so different because when you look at those 1-turn races and she makes that one big run from off the pace. That's not how you should ride that type of horse around 2 turns. She's not going to come from as far back as she was ridden in those races. So I don't think tactically that was the right decision by Espinoza back in the Chandelier last year. Same thing in the Las Virgenes, where she actually did show a good amount of run, all things considered. And then just tough to know what happened in the San Isabel, just kind of an even run, but then the layoff that followed, again, just not the most ideal trip that day. So I appreciate coming back with the rider change, at least trying to change things up. Probably going to be a little bit closer to the pace, not try to run from well off the pace like she had in those 2 starts. She does have to improve. So taking a short price, there are some reservations there. You can make a case that she's not the right runner at a short price, but there's a couple Bob Baffert horses in here that maybe take some money as well. And those 2 races at Del Mar are impressive, and I think she's just deserving of another chance to go around 2 turns.
That's interesting. I was convinced that you picked this race because you were against Justique, but it sounds like you like her a lot more than I was anticipating. And I don't disagree with what you were saying about the running style. I mean, she is a horse that seemed to have trouble getting out of the gate early in her career, and I think that's why she was so far back in a few of those early races. But it reminds me almost a little bit of Mage in the Preakness, when he's a horse that had trouble breaking out of the gate in the Fountain of Youth, Florida Derby, Kentucky Derby, and then the Preakness he finally breaks well, but the jockey is like strangling him back off a slow pace because he felt like he had to get this horse into the position that he's usually in. And with Justique last time, it's like she finally broke well and wanted to go forward, and Espinoza was like intent on ripping her back off that pace, and she resented it a little bit. So I agree with you. She's a horse that it seems like if she breaks well again, doesn't have to be that far back and maybe not be so pace compromised. But even so, in this spot, it feels like there is more speed than there was last time.
Yeah, and again, I mean, to your point, it's typically these type of horses. That's where I start my analysis, right? Is like picking holes in them, trying to find those reasons, and then you go through the rest of the horses in this field, and it's like I can't really find an alternative that those knocks kind of outweigh. There's another horse that I think is creative in here, but with like I said, with those two Baffert runners, people having reservations about the distance with Justique or the trip, etc. Maybe she won't be as short, even if she is favored.
Yeah, I'm on the fence about her. I mean, I think she's okay. I don't totally trust her. I am one of those people that thinks she probably is better going shorter, not because she's like, some sprinter, but because you just generally get more pace in those shorter races and it works more with her style. If she can now break well and can change her running style, it's a different story. And based on the evidence of the last race, maybe that's the case. We'll see how they ride her in this spot. I think you do have to have an opinion about the two Bob Baffert runners. I prefer one much more than the other. Since you gave your thoughts about Justique, I'll just put it out there that I think Lucky for You is way more interesting than Doing It the Hard Way, who doing it the hard way, she seems like a horse that, needs things the easy way if she's going to be successful. She's just a horse that has run well when she's gotten good trips, but she strikes me as one that's just doesn't have that grit and gameness to her, whereas Lucky for You is kind of the opposite. I mean, she looked like she might have been beaten last time, and Hernandez really got into her, and she found more and was able to put that horse away, who challenged her at the top of the stretch. It's a step up in class, but just watching some of her recent workouts, she feels like a horse that maybe Bob Baffert underestimated at the start of her career, and maybe that's why he started her on the turf, because maybe she wasn't training so well, but she feels like a horse that maybe is figuring things out now at this point in her career as a 4-year-old, and I get the sense if one of these two is going to take a step forward, it's more likely to be Lucky for You.
I mean, I like went through trying to find. I couldn't quite get there. I watched the works. I don't have any knocks on them. She also started off as a 4-year-old, which again is not a Baffert thing. Not only is it not turf, but starting horses as a 4-year-old. So I don't know how much upside she has. Now, with that said, the races that she's run in some of those races are kind of fast enough with some of the others in here. So maybe that's just enough. I couldn't get that excited about her. I mean, as far as doing it the hard way, I agree. I mean, she's had the times that she's won, she's had favorable setups. The times that she hasn't. Typically takes money. I think the rider change to Bravo. Maybe that's a positive. Maybe they try to do something a little bit different. Maybe they try to rate a little bit more, especially being on the outside. I would say that of the two, I see where your argument is that Lucky for You probably has more upside if she has kind of turned it on. But in terms of age, doing it the hard way could also present a move forward. But with that said, Bob Baffert runners generally they kind of show who they are. They don't typically move forward that much. What you kind of see is who they are, and then whether they're able to maintain that form is the challenge. And she hasn't really taken that much of a step forward. Her maiden win, the fastest race in this field number wise, but she struggles to kind of run those fast races.
Yeah, I agree. I just don't see the step forward for Doing It the hard way. I get that she's a younger horse. To me, she looks better on paper than she does on replay. She's just one of those horses that when I watch the races,
Yeah.
I'm just not getting it. And Lucky for You, it's the opposite. Like I expected not to like her, and she was really going away from that rival at the end. She galloped out huge in that last race, like opened up 8 lengths on the field. And I thought it was interesting in her most recent workout. Bob Baffert took the blinkers off, which I mean, often I feel like he puts the blinkers on at the start of a horse's career to just like, dial them in, get the maximum out of them right from the start. Kind of like what you were saying. They're ready to go when he sends them to the post for the first time. And maybe the fact that he took the blinkers off in that workout, I mean, there's no blinker change in this race, at least not early that I can see. But maybe it's like a signal that this is a horse that he feels like is finally just, she's got it. Like she's figuring things out. So we'll see if Lucky for You can take a step forward. You mentioned maybe some bigger prices in here. I mean, who do you think might offer value?
Well, I mean, I think there's kind of the two wild card horses for Sanchez in here with Practica Cat and Yuki. I mean, they're probably going to be a pace factor in here, and I would probably assume that Practica Cat is probably better suited to today's conditions, just in terms of the distance. Yuki is fast. She's going to be definitely a pace presence in here, especially with Maldonado. That typically is also a sign of what they're going to do in terms of race. both have to improve. Practica Cat was entered at Del Mar on July 28th. That was a non-winners of one, optional 40. And I don't know if maybe she was a scratch that day because she didn't fit that condition. They realized, okay, she's not an N1X under those conditions. I'm not really sure, but she's coming back in this spot on kind of a quick turnaround, and then with a distance change. Last year during this meet, Amador Sanchez was on fire with everything, and most of those horses with Barrios in the saddle. This meet a little bit colder to start. Some of those horses just not really firing, so have to kind of see what that barn brings. I could throw in another, but I don't know if you want to add anything on those two.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly. I mean, I kind of agree. Practica Cat looks a little more interesting for this spot and the expected pace scenario. I mean, it's kind of funny because Yuki showed so much more speed in that Gulfstream race, but when you look at their Chilean form, Yuki needed like a mile and a quarter to do her best running. And watching that Gulfstream race, I don't know who that horse was that was competing in Chile, but I did not see a mile and a quarter horse in that replay. So just kind of interesting with her. But Practica Cat, I know it was a slow race she comes out of. I just liked the way she kept churning on at the end and felt like, she was really staying, even though it was just 6 furlongs. So the mile here, it makes a lot of sense for her. It's not like either one of these horses projects to be that short a price. So I could definitely use Practica Cat.
The other one that's just kind of wild in here is Smooth Like Butter, and she's one that's in terms of class is pretty soft, but as we're kind of picking holes through this field, it's sort of like there's no real standout, especially if Justique doesn't take a step forward at all. Or the horse that you mentioned, Lucky for You, is not one of those improving types. Smooth Like Butter is right in the mix, and she's just been running. She's another one that those last 3 races, she didn't really fit. She might have been in to fill the race in some of those graded stakes races, just kind of taking a shot, hoping they pick up a share. Same thing out at Pleasanton. It was on a quick turnaround in 2 weeks. She was restless in the gate, so just giving off signs that was just not her day. She's had the 42-day freshening. She's run well here at Del Mar in the past. Just looking at her numbers and speed figures, they just fit with all the other runners in this field, and assuming that because she's one of the more established runners, to running back to those isn't that much of a reach. And Pereira being aboard for some of those, and back aboard today, which obviously the circuit switch makes the obvious move. But if the pace is quick, and expecting with Yuki, with some of the others in this field, Smooth Like Butter could also just get a trip in here. Able to save ground come closing late. So one that is not the most exciting horse when you look at it on paper, but if there are some in here that don't step up, maybe she is the one that just runs her race and it's good enough on the day.
Yeah, that's kind of how I viewed her. I mean, she obviously has a ceiling that's already established, and maybe some others are going to have a ceiling that's a little higher if they move forward. But I mean, it's based on what they've done up until this point. She fits. I mean, she's kind of like the brew pub in the race we just talked about at Saratoga. I mean, she's, there's nothing sexy about her, but she just makes sense in this race based on speed figures and the projected race flow. So, I mean, this is a race if you're looking at the Timeform US pace projector, fast pace predicted. I mean, obviously the 2 Bob Baffert runners are kind of integral to that, so we'll see how both of them are ridden. But even with the the Amador Sanchez runners in here, it feels like one of them is going to be aggressive, probably Yuki. So it just maybe sets it up for a closer like her. And she's the kind of horse that I would have trouble pulling the trigger on the top end, but she just makes a lot of sense and is the kind of horse that if you're playing exactas and trifectas, I mean, she's the kind of horse you could key on because she's going to offer value, and there's a pretty good chance she's going to be in the mix somewhere.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I wanted to give her a mention. She's not without a chance to compete.
All right, let's move on to the 1 stakes we're going to talk about on this Del Mar card, the California Dreamin'. It is race 9. California breds going a mile and a 16th on the turf course. And King's River Knight is the clear favorite on the morning line. He's done his fair share of winning recently. I mean, hasn't been out of the exact. Has been out of the exact, I should say, just once in 10 career starts. I mean, obviously a consistent performer. Feels like he's got a difficult pace scenario to deal with here, though, Emily, because he's a horse that in recent starts, especially since coming into the John Sadler barn, has really been using that early speed to great effect. And if the intention is to go forward again here, he's supposed to have some company.
Yeah, I struggle with him, just really assessing him and in terms of trip, and saw it the same way. And that really, with the other pace setters in here, you're always assuming that the riders are doing what the horses are supposed to do, right? Which doesn't always play out. But if the riders do what the horses are supposed to do, this pace is supposed to be quick. Kings River Knight has that kind of natural early speed. He's been able to rate and sit off, so they Rispoli has some options. But if they do kind of go with some of those others that are supposed to go, that could be one vulnerability for this horse. If they try to run from off the pace, then they're going to have to try to work a trip a little bit. That hasn't quite been as effective in the past. They did win that way here at Del Mar last September, but that was a softer spot that day. And I agree. I mean, Kings River Knight is very logical as an individual, but how he stacks up in this race could maybe present some opportunities for others.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, he's a horse that I think has gotten some favorable trips and circumstances recently. I mean, his two most recent turf races, he's got some blue color coded pace figures in TimeformUS, just favorable race flows, and then probably not beating the toughest field on dirt last time at Los Alamitos. So I feel like he's a little dressed up. And looking at the race through that lens that it could be contested on the front end, my first inclination was to try to make a case for Carmelita's Man. And, I kind of want to get your take on this horse, Emily, because at first glance, it looks like he's maybe not in the form that he was last year when he actually came to Del Mar and won this race. Because that year, I mean, he was coming off the same layoff, but he had won the Crystal Water in his prior start and, just had a big Del Mar meet last year. This year, it feels like maybe he's lacked some of that sharpness, but some of it could be due to trips or race flow. So I had trouble really wrapping my head around him.
Yeah, and I kind of felt like he's a horse that would get a lot of attention here because he does have those races. And it is worth noting that last year at Del Mar, trainer Dean Peterson just had like a lights out meet. Everything he sent out was running. Didn't matter if it was a first time starter at a big price or this horse coming back to pair up wins at different distances and facing open company. He had favorable trips in those races. Again, the barn was live, number wise, weren't super strong, pretty consistent with what he's been running. The barn, again, was a little bit cold last out at Santa Anita. This barn can kind of do that, just kind of hot or cold. Haven't had enough of a sample of the runners this meet to kind of find out where that is. And I just thought as one of the horses that was going to kind of be the more obvious kind of second choice type horse. I wanted to look elsewhere. He wouldn't be a surprise, but double layoff lines, some favorable trips, streaking barn last year. There might be some others in here that are a little bit under the radar.
Who would be those others for you?
Well, one of them is Not Above the Law, number 3, which is a horse I kind of took a while to kind of get to, and then I sort of made the case. I mean, his races at Del Mar and in graded stakes company in the past are strong, and even against open company, it was as a 3-year-old coming back this year. Or actually, I'll start back last year. His races last year were fine. They were fast races. Just wasn't the right trip. Was just kind of in tougher company in those races. They reset the form cycle this year, coming back in Santa Anita at the Crystal Water Stakes, where they Vespas rode him closer to the pace that day, which isn't this horse's best running style. So it kind of just signals, barn also a little bit cold at the time, kind of giving this horse a prep race, wanting to get some fitness in him, not expecting much in terms of the outcome. And sort of the same thing in terms of the race at Los Alamitos on the main track, another surface that maybe he's not his best at, but can compete if he's in the right field. But they had to keep him a little bit closer to the pace that day from the rail, from the complexion of that race. There's plenty of pace in here, as we talked about. So he's third off the layoff. He has that fitness under his belt. Should get back to his preferred running style. Bravo's been aboard in the past, has won on this horse, won the Del Mar Derby. Likely take this horse from off the pace. And I think that could be the right trip in here, and a horse that's probably going to get overlooked off those two most recent races. And if those are just kind of prep and fitness and changing the running style, he gets back to a top effort. Has some of the stronger form in this field.
Yeah, no, I think that he's going to be a bigger price than 8-1 in this race, just because it kind of just looks like he's off form, and maybe he is. I mean, like you said, he's got those back numbers that make him very competitive. I didn't like the visual of his last couple of races, but if he can turn it around, I mean, he does have that back form. I mean, of the two Peter Miller runners, I mean, Indian Peak just seemed way more logical, and he's a horse that I guess you could also say, question his form a little bit, but I don't love him in those 6.5 furlong sprint races. I mean, it just feels like he often runs out of ground, and he's run fine going longer in the past. I mean, the trip was just wrong when he tried the Wicker Stakes last summer, and he was off for a long time after that, so it feels like something probably happened that day. I think it's just a horse that makes a lot of sense in here, especially given the pace scenario. When I was sort of initially making that case for Carmelita's Man, I ended up shifting over to Indian Peak and just feeling like he made a lot more sense in this spot.
Well, it's funny because when I got to None Above the Law, I was initially on Indian Peak for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. And part of the reason I ended up shifting away is because of the draw. And I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, the 10 post is only 4%. It comes down to how the horse runs and what kind of trip they're going to get, right? And he's drawn on the outside. They're either going to have to take back early to save ground, then he's going to have to pass a lot of horses, and that has not been an effective strategy in the past. All the other pace in this race is on his inside. So if they try to get position early, they're going to be caught wide. I don't know if that's going to be a positive for him either. And being one of those that does look more obvious, I think like I said, I landed on him because he seems very logical. And then when it came down to trip, I was like, how does this horse win? How does this horse win this race? What trip does he get in order to win? His numbers are there. He's run well at the distance, run well in this class company. But what trip? Where's he gonna be to win this race? I can't see a scenario.
As you're saying that, I kind of find myself coming over to your side and agreeing with you because, I mean, I haven't watched probably as many Del Mar races as you have, certainly not. But the few turf races that I have watched at this meet, it just kind of hammers home how important saving ground is. And when you get that rail trip around the far turn, it just feels like you've got those extra 2 lengths to work with at the top of the stretch. And the horses that try to make that slingshot move around the field, I mean, unless you really time it right, it's a hard thing to do. And to be honest, I don't have that much faith that this rider is going to have the wherewithal to save ground at any point in this race. I mean, he's the rider that gave him that crazy wide trip last year that I thought was ridiculous. So that's a big concern that maybe I was overlooking a little bit too much when I initially started gravitating towards this horse. The number 8 Bally's Charm is one that you probably initially want to be skeptical of because there's other speed in this race and he's drawn outside of them. This horse is pretty good watching his races. It's a big ask off the layoff.
Yeah, and again, another one in the pace scenario that maybe they're hard set. Maybe they just said, come beat us on the front end. We know what we're good at. Take a shot. Serious rider upgrade coming back in this race. And I agree. I mean, he's good. He's fast early. He can, he seems... he's going to make a factor in this race. I don't know if it's a winning one, but being on the lead, if they let him go, like I said, I don't know, like Jimmy Blue Jeans, you'd expect to be forwardly placed, but he used to train. He was the former trainer of Kings River Knight. So I don't know if they're going to try to push too hard in here. And maybe Kings River Knight will say, hey, we can rate off the pace and we'll kind of sit and stalk. And then all of a sudden Bally's Charm is like, cool, we'll go and we'll take this field as far as we can on the front end. So I don't mind that idea just at the right price. I agree. It's just going to come down to if he kind of gets the trip and again, being ready. Mullins has been doing fine this meet, not, super hot, super cold, just kind of even. And it's tough to see when you look at like the form on paper, but sometimes it's, it comes down to trip and things like that. And like, a good 4th place finish that should have been 2nd won't show up in the past performances. And sort of the same thing, number 9, Bang for Your Buck, is another horse that kind of run some subtle races, and another one that trip is going to have to be key, but could work a trip in here and could be kind of in the right spot and overlooked at a price that I would use just on that alone. Going to need a lot in his favor in order to win, but there'll be price compensation.
Yeah, my crazy price in this race was the number 1 Royal and Rando, who I get it. He probably doesn't have any race you could point to that say this race makes him competitive here, but he's drawn inside, he's got the right running style, and his Turf Classic back in January, 2 back, it's not that bad. I mean, he crossed the line right with Carmelita's man, and he got steadied legitimately on the far turn of that race. Maybe it was a little one paced when he finally got into the stretch, but it just feels like a horse that has really improved since he was at Del Mar last year. And he's coming off a layoff, probably got a prep in back in May, and now they've been freshening him up again. I actually don't mind this horse's turf races earlier in his career, and it just feels like a horse that's going to be a gigantic price in this race that could get a piece of this if things break the right way. Because I don't totally trust that some of the shorter prices are going to show up.
Yeah, I don't mind that idea. I don't mind that idea at all for all those reasons.
All right, let's close things out with the final race we'll talk about from Del Mar, and starter allowance race, same two-turn on the turf. This one's going a mile for the fillies and mares, and it's hard to find a much more evenly matched field than this one, Emily. I mean, it's just from speed figures to like horses coming out of similar types of races. I mean, I kept going through this field and it's like, this horse looks the same, this one looks the same, contender, contender, contender. I mean, it's really hard to separate the runners in here.
Well, and I probably the morning line maker thought the same thing. As 4 horses at 6-1 and another one at 5, and then your morning line favorite is 3-5 with an Irish Patsy, who you kind of just have to be questioning at a short price just anytime a horse is doing something new, right? So yeah, I think this is a extremely competitive race, and if you are closing out anything, probably want a few on your ticket. But I think there's a couple horses in here that maybe still sneak under the radar at fair prices.
Yeah, I mean, so of those horses that are 6-1 or less, the one that I want no part of is the number 2, In Your Face, who coming off a long layoff, broke its maiden last time out, and the numbers that I'm looking at in TimeformUS and DRF has her the fastest horse in the race based on that last speed figure. I don't know. I mean, turf speed figures are tough to make, and a lot of it is just making them like dirt speed figures, comparing them to the other races of the day, but it can be misleading because paces are so different, and that's a number that just makes absolutely no sense. I mean, the other horses in that race,
it's also a pretty favorable trip.
Yes, I mean, she got a great trip, and that just seems like a speed figure jump that doesn't make any sense for a lot of horses in that race, so I'm not viewing her as any kind of contender in here. The number 7, Irish Patsy, I feel like you covered the big flaw with her. In a race where they all look so evenly matched, I don't want the one that's really never done this before. I mean, there are some reasons to think that distance could be okay for her. Michael McCarthy has decent stretch out statistics. If you look them up in Formulator, a positive ROI on the turf. And there is a little bit of pedigree for it, but I can't say that I would want to take a short price on this horse. And I found myself sort of looking towards the outside as being the horses to beat. Picture of a Lady and Tiergarten. They both seem solid. I know they're coming off maiden victories against maiden claiming company, each of them, but I liked their races. I thought it was interesting that they protected Picture of a Lady off the layoff last time. I think they took advantage of that claiming waiver option that's available, not run her for the tag, and now she's back in a protected spot, a starter allowance race. So I just think that there is some intention maybe for her to move forward in here. And then Tiergarten, I know she took a while to break her maiden, but she was pretty powerful last time, beating Precocious Times, who came back with a solid-looking maiden victory of her own next time. So I don't love the post positions for either of these horses, but I think they both make a lot of sense.
I was more interested in Tiergarten than Picture of a Lady. Perhaps she has another move forward. She would have to show it. She has some obvious issues. A late vet scratch back in May of this year before coming back to win that race, where she did kind of have a favorable trip and rushed up, and just figures like she's going to be kind of shorter than what I would want in this particular race. Tiergarten is another one. It did take her a while to break her maiden, but going back, she debuted back in 2021 in the summer, and that day she broke slow, she was wide, and looked like a horse that needed more ground than that 5.5. And they came back, and we're going to run at Del Mar last summer at a route race. Had to be a scratch that day, ran on August 4th, and she was completely wasted. Like, before the race, she just was one of those race days that this horse lost their race even before it started. This horse is not going to win. Like, you know it when you see it, and it doesn't come up in the form. So I can excuse that race. She was wide on the Del Mar turf on September 10th. That's in the closing part of the meet. You talked about it earlier. Being wide on the Del Mar turf course, like, good luck. You have to be so much the best. Was better than looked sprinting, then improved, and probably was pretty tight. You could almost say she won both those races before finally. She's just, she's consistent. She's consistent. Gonna have to work a trip in here, but I can't knock, and I don't mind her stepping up against winners because she has so much foundation.
I think this is a race where it's kind of tough to determine who's going to be going forward to the front end. I mean, I think that the number 6, Tickle My Fancy, I mean, obviously she showed speed in a 5 furlong race last time in Monmouth, so you might project her to be the leader, especially with an aggressive rider on her back. I don't have a ton of confidence in her getting a mile. Just seems like it's a little bit far for her, but this is a horse that I think is a little better than maybe her numbers might indicate. I mean, she faced a really, really tough field last time at Monmouth. I mean, I'm sorry, a 2-back in Monmouth. That maiden special weight race won by Surge Capacity, who came back to win a graded stakes at her next start at Saratoga. I mean, she's faced good horses a number of times in her career. And interesting trainer switch now to Doug O'Neill and finding this condition for her. I wouldn't say that I love her in this spot, but it's one of those races where the turn comes up pretty quickly going a mile, and sometimes the horse that just gets to the front is able to back down the pace a little bit, and I could see maybe her being in that driver's seat.
Possibly, maybe that's the intention. I just thought she had to work. She had to work hard to get the win at 5 furlongs. Maybe she is better a little bit longer, but it just comes down to time because she's had to ship and she's going to run back in 30 days, and maybe one of those that they'll protect her here and then they'll run her back and in for a tag. I wasn't that crazy about her. I thought she's one that maybe she would get a lot of wagering support because people love the ship and win angle. Another horse that I think is going to show speed in here. Actually, I'm almost positive they're going to show speed. Is the 3, our Swerve and Gervin, because it's a common pattern for Capestro runners. This horse is stretching out from 2 sprints. They're putting the blinkers on. A lot of their success here in Del Mar is when horses just go to the front and just hold. Like they just nobody runs with them. They just get game out there, and I think that's a plan for this one. And they're inside, and I think they're gonna send and be the pace setter in this race.
Yeah, I agree. I was initially trying to make a case for this horse. I'm not sure she's good enough. She feels like one that could be forward, though, especially taking advantage of that inside draw. I don't know how much upside she really has. They claimed her from connections at Gulfstream that I certainly wouldn't want to claim from. Or I should say Tampa, rather.
Tampa. But yeah. No, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially owner and trainer that, seem to get the most out of the horses, let's say. So I was looking more towards some others for value. I mean, what's your take on the number 5, DeJoria, who I think you can certainly build a case for her having faced tougher runners in some of those synth and turf races?
Yeah, and I think that's probably why she's probably going to be a little bit shorter in here as well. She's kind of run three optics figures that are kind of in the low mid or on the mid higher 80s side, which is above today's race par. So in terms of class and in terms of in the right spot, she checks all those boxes. Hess has been sending out live runners. I think she's fine. I think she's fine in here. I just worry she's going to be a little bit of an underlay, just kind of based on that. In this type of race where I'm not sure if Irish Patsy ends up being favored, it could be this horse. I don't know. I could kind of see that scenario. And I just feel like, if I was playing her off the layoff in this spot as one I kind of followed, a little bit back from Woodbine, I would just want a little bit more.
So I'm getting the sense that you don't have a strong conviction in this race, or maybe we haven't arrived at the horse you really like yet. I mean, it's just
no. I think this is a race that you want to be spread a little bit and take some shots with some horses to pop up. Like I would use our Swerve and Gervin. Maybe she's not the best, but at least I know this is going to be the spot where they're going to try to win. They're going to go to the front. They have the blinkers on, and maybe this is it. That could be the scenario in this spot where this horse wins. I'm not that interested in Tickle My. We talked about that one. Precious Baby is one that I'm definitely interested in. I was following her working out for quite a while, even before she made her maiden debut, a winning one. Just kind of took a while, had some setbacks, finally getting to the races, brushed up, showed a lot of class in order to get the win on the front end. Slight upset that day, but she made a lot of sense if you're watching the works. And I didn't like the timing and the placement running back. That's opening day at Santa Anita. I think they were just kind of taking a shot. Expected a little bit more when she ran against State Bred Company back on the turf, but was wide that day, chasing a pretty honest pace before losing ground. So I can give an excuse that day. Then she was slow. Then she was on the dirt, sprinting, not ideal. Broke slow in both those races. Gets back on the turf on May 26th. Jumps back to a good race. Was facing Open Company in that race. Pretty solid race par. Was kind of first start off the layoff. Not quite on the level that day. Also a 4-horse field, so those races are sometimes tough. She just gets back to the turf. Her turf races are good. This is where she fits. So I'm going to give her a look in here as one that maybe gets a little bit overlooked. And I think, Precocious Times was kind of another one. A little bit tougher, softer number wise. And coming off the win, I wouldn't want to take a short price. Don't like the double layoff. I was kind of hit or miss on her. I wasn't sure which way to go.
Yeah, I was initially liking her a little bit until I watched her race with Tiergarten, where Tiergarten was just so much better than she was. I do think Precocious Times has more upside. I just don't know if it's going to be going a mile at Del Mar. I think she's a horse, watching her run, she's got this big rangy stride, and a mile and an eighth at Santa Anita, I think later on might be a good spot for her. I just think more distance is going to be beneficial. But if the trip works out, I could see her getting a piece of this. So yeah, I was leaning towards Picture of a Lady, Tiergarten, and a little bit of Tickle My Fancy, but it's a tough race to have strong feelings about because, like we said at the start, they all look so similar.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that both you and I align on Tiergarten. Maybe that's a positive for her. We've done well. We've lined up on horses on the turf, and then using a few of those others, just some kind of crazy ideas if there is some chaos.
Well, that takes us through the 6 races that we planned on discussing. We were chatting a little bit before we started recording. It's just a great card, especially at Saratoga on Saturday. I mean, the Whitney is a race that is maybe a little disappointing from a wagering standpoint. I mean, it's always nice to see a good horse, and Cody's Wish, arguably the best horse in the country right now, but it's just, I know it's like being billed as this big 2-turn test for him. To me, it's like a softer race than the one he won in the Met Mile last time, so I don't know how much of a test it really is. I feel like he's probably going to win. It wasn't one of the more interesting races of the day, but there's a lot around that Whitney that is interesting at Saratoga on Saturday.
Yeah, it is. A lot of the horses in here, he is going to be tested at the 9 furlongs, but I think some of these other horses are also going to be tested at 9 furlongs, and 9 furlongs isn't their ideal either. And so if you're just saying, okay, it's not really the ideal distance for any of these horses, Cody's Wish just has a class edge. And it's 2 races around 2 turns. I mean, there's only 2 of them. Make some excuses for him. Second start here at Saratoga at 9 furlongs. So at least at one point they thought he was a 9 furlong horse, or at least were willing to give him a chance. And then the other race was that Challenger at Tampa, which was a really strong race, all things considered. Scalding, which was a Shug McGahee horse, came back and won the Ben Ali, which is a grade 3. And there was other horses in here that are quality, Greatest Honor, Dynamic One, Wolfie's Dynaghost, just some good race horses. So that's a pretty solid field. And he ran well in that race. So if you're going to say, you're concerned about the distance, obviously he's going to be a shorter price, but a lot of those horses in there also have some class and distance questions, and probably the horse that's best suited to the 9 furlongs is Last Samurai, and maybe that's just the equalizer because he's been a little bit below in grade 1s, but at least if you're saying, if you're going to pull off the 9 furlong card, he's the horse that is his ideal distance.
Yeah, I get that. It's just, I didn't view this as a race where I thought distance was going to be a major separator, because a lot of the other horses I was considering, like you were saying, the Zandons and especially White Abario, who maybe got not the ideal trip in the Met Mile last time, I'm not convinced he's better going longer either. So it just felt like a race where Cody's Wish was going to be awfully tough. And yeah, that 9 furlong race he ran at Saratoga in just his second start, he got an insane trip that day. So definitely a result that you just shouldn't take at face value. He's not one that I was personally trying to beat. But there are plenty of other races earlier in the card where you can try to beat favorites. You were saying that maybe even Caravel might look a little vulnerable in that Troy Stakes early in the day. So there's a lot to be interested in if you like to beat favorites at Saratoga on Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, before getting into that, we'll just touch, I know we're going a little bit long, but yeah, I mean, Caravel she's going to be tested with no balls in the race. That horse is fast, and they put him on the front, and he is so tough, and she could be chasing him. There's some others in there that want to be on and near the lead. It's one of those races that you start handicapping it for pace. She could be a little bit vulnerable in there, and maybe that even makes Snowball's a little bit vulnerable in there. So then you kind of start, working elsewhere. I like just pulled up the race right before we got on the call, so it's what I'm going to dig into a little bit more, but definitely what I'm going to dig into a little bit more.
Well, Emily, I really appreciate you making the time to come on the podcast and discuss this week. It's a really great week in racing, not only seeing the star horses, but also having these great cards to handicap at Saratoga and Del Mar. So really appreciate you coming on to share your thoughts.
Absolutely, anytime.
Everybody, thanks for tuning in this week. Make sure to always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on drf.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in this week. Craig's going to be back on Tuesday to recap some of these races on the Pacecast, so make sure to catch that when it comes out next Tuesday.